guys, welcome back to the shader graph tutorial series. The first video we looked at some of the things you can do with shader graph, some of the cool effects we can achieve by using shader graph. And this is going to be the first tutorial. We're actually going to start making a shader. We're going to start off something really simple. We're going to make a brick wall. We're going to put some graffiti on it. We're going to put some dirt on it. We're going to put some leakage on it. And we're going to blend it with a height map and make it look really nice, and see how we can repeat that over a large area and make it not look the same every time that object is placed. Right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a very basic model to start with 3ds Max. Okay, so going to make a plane. Going to rotate it so it's facing upwards. I'm just going to make sure it's maybe 4 meters by 4 meters. Make sure it's positioned zeroed. Make an editable poly. And that is all we need for now. Just to start off with our shader. We'll come back to this and we'll add in some decals and stuff with UV placement later on. For now, that'll be fine. Just going to export this FPX into my project. I'm going to call it wall. Alright, so got my wall model. Going to bring this in, and now we've just got this nice flat plane that's got nothing going on for it right now. Okay, so we're going to first off we're going to create a material, and then we're going to change that material to use the shader graph that we're going to make. So I'm going to create a new material. I'm going to call it wall shader tutorial. Okay, now I'm going to make a new shader as well. I'm going to go create. Where is shader? Create shader, HDRP, lit graph. I'm going to call it blend shader tutorial. Okay, so this material that we've made here is by default is using HDRP lit. So I'm just going to change the shader that it uses. I'm going to type in blend shader tutorial. So you see we've got this default shader here with absolutely 0 options, and it won't do anything yet. I'm going to drag that in, and as you can see it's just doing absolutely nothing. Alright, so I'm going to select the shader here. I'm going to press open shader editor. Okay, so what we've got here is the lit master. This is where all our different textures and stuff all feed into this, and this is our output basically. Okay, just make this a little bit smaller. Alright, so first thing we want to do is get a very basic texture in, which is just going to be bricks, and it's going to be an albedo, it's going to be a normal, it's going to be a smoothness, a roughness map. So I already have a brick. If you don't have one, just go and bring it in from somewhere, but I've got a brick that I'm using here with a shader. I'm just going to grab that. Going to grab the albedo, the height, the normal, the roughness. Going to duplicate those and bring them over into my little folder here. Okay, so this material, it's got no options for me to put any of these textures in yet, right? So what we're going to do, first thing we're going to do, we're going to, well, before that I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. I'm going to add in a new input for the shader, which is going to be a texture 2D, and that lets me sample one of these textures. Okay, so I'm going to call this albedo. I'm just going to drag that in to the shader. Okay, now I'm going to go create node. I'm going to go texture 2D, sample texture 2D, right? And by default this uses UV0, which is fine for now. We will change that eventually. So albedo, we're just going to connect this up to texture, and now we're going to connect this out to the base color output. Okay, and we're going to shade that. Just wait for that to go along. Sometimes it takes a bit of time on the first save of a new shader. Now you see we've got this exposed property pop up where we can put in our albedo. So let's go back to our scene. Now I'm going to drag this albedo in, and there we have it. We have our first bit of shader action going on. So now I'm going to do the same thing for the normal map and the roughness map. Alright, so you come in here, I'm going to go text 2D again. I'm going to call it normal. going to add in another text 2D. I'm going to call it roughness, and then I'm just going to select these. Then I'm going to press Control D to duplicate, Control D to duplicate again. Can delete this albedo tag because we don't actually want that. I'm going to bring the normal in, I'm going to bring the roughness in, and the normal I'm going to connect to there. And what you have to do differently for normals is, instead of it being type default, you're going to change that to type normal. Okay. Now I'm going to drag that to the normal output, and now I'm going to get this roughness up, and I'm going to connect that to the smoothness here. Now, you see, because I've added these two new options here, I've got two new options exposed in my material. So you see by default that's made it super shiny and weird, but I'm gonna drag in my normal, gonna drag in my roughness, and now we have normal map, and we've got our roughness map, and you see we've got a bit of shine there, as it should, which is great. Now we want a bit of control over these, right? So one of the things I don't like about the default HDRP lit shader is it doesn't let you have much control over what the albedo looks like. You can add a tint, so you can make it darker, you can change the color, but you can't, for instance, make it less saturated or make it brighter or affect the contrast. So we're going to have a look at how to do that as well, because that is something I put on every shader, and you probably should as well. Okay, so we've got our lit mask. I'm just going to bring this over to get a bit of space. Okay, now I'm going to just close these up because we don't really need to see what they're doing now. So I'm going to put in some slider controls now. So we've learned how to put in textures into our material slots. Now we're going to put some sliders in. So you've got different types of numbers, right, in these shaders that you can put in, or C# or whatever. Vector 1, Vector 2, Vector 3, Vector 4. So a Vector 1, that is basically a single number. A Vector 2 is two numbers as a pair. A Vector 4 is four numbers as a group, right? But for these, we just want a Vector 1, right? Because we want a single control from like 0 to 1, for instance, that controls the saturation. So the first one I'm going to call it saturation, and I'm going to make it type slider, and the saturation I'm probably going to want to go between 0 and 2, probably, just so I want to bump the saturation up. So I'm going to put 0 and 2, I'm going to default it's going to be 1. Okay. Now I'm going to make a new one called contrast. Going to change it to slider again. Going to put the default to 1 again, and probably I'm going to do min 0 and max as 3 maybe. Okay. So right now how this is working is we've got our albedo going into our sample, and then we're just connecting this node straight to the output. But what we actually want to be doing is some stuff here in between. So I'm going to go create node, I'm going to go contrast, and I'm going to go create node saturation. Okay, and this will control the contrast, this will control the saturation. Fairly straightforward stuff. So my saturation control, which is going to be a slider, I'm going to put here, and I'm going to put this into the saturation controller. And then the same for the contrast, I'm going to put this here, and that's going to control the contrast. So you don't actually have to put these in. You could just change contrast by typing 0 in here, or whatever you want. But I want to have this as a slider exposed in my material, so I'm just going to drag this in, and now the slider that will appear here, I can just drag and slide, and that will affect this control. So instead of connecting my sample text 2D straight to the output, I'm going to connect it to the input of this contrast. And I'm going to drag it down. I like to try and keep these organized. Now I'm going to drag the output of this contrast into the input of this saturation, and I'm going to drag the output of this saturation to the base color. And there we have it. Now I can save this, and now you see we've got these sliders appear. Now if I drag this, you should see our contrast goes up on our base texture, and our saturation will go up and down. So I could bring the contrast really far up, but the saturation kind of low, or I could bring gives you kind of a lot of control, right? Now one of the things you might want to do is change the color a bit, so we're going to add in a few other options here. So we're going to add in a tint, we're going to add in a white balance. Let me think, what else do I normally put on these? Tint, tint, white balance, and that should probably be enough actually. So let's put in a tint. So we're going to do a new option now. Instead of vector 1 like we were doing before, we're going to do a color, because we're going to tint our albedo with a color. So this gives us a color control in our shader. So we're going to call this color tint, and default we want to have as white, and let's make that a little bit bigger. Then we're going to put in a new one, and we're going to do white balance. So we're going to call this white balance, and we're going to make this a slider just like the other sliders we had. And I'm going to put the default was 0, which is no changes to white balance. Going to go min -1, max 1. So it's going to let me make the slider go between -1 and +1, but defaulting it 0. Okay, so we can close those up. Now, how are we going to do this? So I'm going to bring in a multiply node. Okay, and I'm going to take the saturation output here. Going to bring our albedo into the top slot of the multiply node, and then bring this to the base color output. I'm going to bring my color tint control in, plug that into the second slot of multiply, and now what that's going to do is it's going to take the albedo texture and it's going to multiply it with that color. Now, if you're familiar with how Photoshop works and how the blend modes work in there, that's the same thing. If you go into Photoshop and you put an image in and then you put another color over the top and multiply it, it will basically affect the tint of the underlying layer. And then we're going to do a white balance node as well. So the white balance node has 3 inputs. We're going to have the in inputs where we're going to plumb our albedo into, and we're going to take the output and plug it into the output master, and then the temperature slot, that is where we want to be bringing this in and plumbing that there. Okay, so now if I select this material again, now I've got this color tint, so I should be able to make it yellow if I wanted, make it blue if I wanted. You can do whatever you want. Maybe you want to make it a bit darker. Any of that stuff you can do. And then the white balance, we should bring that back to default, bring the contrast back to 1, saturation back to 1. Now the white balance will just let you make it a little bit more blue or a little bit more red, which kind of helps to blend stuff in. I found that you often want textures to be harmonizing with one another. So for instance, if I take this wall texture here and I was to affect the white balance of this and to put it back to 0, or maybe bring it back a bit, it looks kind of out of place. This looks too blue, this looks too yellow. So you kind of, I find having these white balance helps you get kind of a balance between your kind of color mix. Take that back to where it was. Okay, so there we have a very basic set of controls for albedo. One other thing that we want to be able to do is be able to lighten the texture as well. We bring that back to 0 as well. One thing that you wouldn't be able to do with the color tint is lighten stuff. Multiplier only ever makes stuff darker, so we're going to add another control in called lighten. Okay, we're going to go vector 1, lighten. We're going to make it a slider, and we're just going to go 0 and 1 for this, because what we can do is we're going to take our albedo and blend it with a completely solid white color, and we're going to use our slider to control the amount of white that gets overlaid onto our albedo. So we're going to go blend. We're going to take our albedo and put it into the base. Now we're going to connect that output back to the base color over here. Now the lighten control that we're having input here, we're going to put that into the opacity. We're going to change the blend mode to lighten, and what we're going to use to blend that with, so we're blending our albedo, which is going into base, and we're going to blend that with something which is going to be a white color node. And then the lighten control affects how much white gets overlaid. So if we go back into the scene, drag this up, you see you can fade it all the way to white if you want. But I find sometimes that you'll get a material that's a texture from an external source that's too dark and you want to brighten it, and you can't with HDRP lit, right? So sometimes I might want to lighten something. I might want to make it a bit of a tint of another colour maybe. Maybe I want to bring the contrast up, and all of a sudden you can start taking these base materials and making them quite different to what they're like by default. Take that colour tint off as well. Okay, so that's everything we're going to need for a basic albedo, apart from UV positioning, right? So by default, when I made this plane in 3ds Max, it's used a base UV map, and you can see that it works. So I could go into 3ds Max and put on UV map modifiers, but actually for a lot of these base textures I do them as triplanar. Okay, so we're going to look at how we can do this material as triplanar instead of using the UV0, the first UV channel. Okay, so instead of using the sample texture 2D, we're going to use a triplanar node to sample it. So we're going to triplanar, bring that down a bit. Just going to drag that into there, into the texture slot instead. Going to take that over here. I'm going to delete that, and now that base texture will be triplanar instead. And then we've also got this tiling that we need to sort out. So going to make a new control on our shader. Going to call this base texture tiling. Going to bring that all the way to the top, probably. Good place for it. Going to make it a slider. I'm going to give it maybe between 0 and 2. I think that'll work. Actually, I'm going to make the default as 0.5 maybe. And I'm going to bring this into the tile slot here. Now, if we test this, now what you see in mostly here is the normal map. So what I need to do is do the same thing that I've done here with these other two samples. So I'm going to delete these. Gonna duplicate these two. Control D. Bring it to here. Bring it to here. The one that's for a normal map, I'm going to change to type normal again. Going to bring the normal sample texture to the texture slot. Going to bring the roughness sample texture to the texture slot, and now I'm just going to plumb this output from the normal map into the input of the master node normal map slot. Going to take the roughness and pop that into the smoothness slot as well. Save that, and now we have a triplanar texture. Now the texture will stay put. So one good thing of doing this is now if I was to duplicate this and to put it here, and I'm going to hold V on my keyboard to select this vertex, going to drag it to there. Oops. Now I'm going to duplicate these, bring it up here, going to hold V to snap it. That doesn't want to do that. Let's try again. Okay. Now I've given it this tiling slider, so now I can bring up, change the tiling amount. I reckon probably about there is good for brick. Now if I was to select this and this, now they will move together, and the texture will always be seamless between the different objects, right? Because of that triplanar node, which is really handy. Delete those. I'm going to bring it back down to earth. And now, so we've put in a bunch of controls that affects the albedo. Now we're going to do some controls that affects the normal map, and I'm just going to bring that base time down to 0.15. No, 0.3. We can do some controls for the roughness as well. So we've got a little chain of stuff going on here for the albedo. Now we're going to do a chain of stuff for the normal map, or maybe just one node here. So we're going to make a new slider with the vector 1. We're going to call it normal strength. We're going to make it a slider. We're going to have the default as 1, which is just as it would normally be. We're going to go min 0, maybe max of 4 perhaps. Sometimes it does work bumping up a normal map strength quite a bit. Going to type in normal here, going to choose the normal strength. Now we're going to just plumb the output of our normal map into the input of this. Now we're going to take our normal strength slider, pop it here, connect it to the strength input. Now I'm going to connect this to the normal map output on our master node. Save that. Now we should have the slider that lets us affect the normal map. Nice and simple. Now we want to have another slider as well that lets us control the strength of our shininess as well, right? That's quite important, shiny stuff. Which is a little bit more complicated, but bear with me. I'm going to put in 2 new vector ones. I'm going to go smoothness min. Going to go smoothness max. Going to make these both sliders. Going to make these both 0 to 1. And that's all we need there. So now we're going to put in a new node, and this is the remap node. So the input is going to be our roughness texture, which is just a black and white image, which tells it where to be shiny and where to not be shiny. The second slot, we're going to change this -1 to 0. So this is going to be 0 and 1 because we're mapping between 0 and 1. And now we're going to take the smoothness min and smoothness max, and we're going to combine those into a vector 2, which, like I said before, is a group or a list of 2 numbers. So I'm going to type in vector 2, check this as a node, get this in as a node. We're going to bring in the smoothness min, smoothness max. We're going to connect the min to the top, the max to the bottom. And we're going to output this into the bottom slot of the remap. Now I'm going to take this remaps output into our smoothness slot. Going to just tidy this up a little bit. And now you see we've got no shine whatsoever, but I'm going to bring the smoothness max up. Now we've got a bit of shine. But now if we bring the smoothness min up, now we're super shiny. So now you got these nice little bit of control over the smoothness. Similar to how the HDRP lit works by default. For this brick I probably wouldn't want it that shiny, probably something like that would work. So that's it, there is your basic brick wall. Replicating what HDRP lit does with just a bunch of controls, and you can just go wild with this stuff. You could do whatever you want. You could go into create node, go to artistic, look at all the different nodes you got here. Just you got channel mixer, invert colors, replace color, all this type of stuff. You've got hue. You can go crazy with it really. So, but that's all we need for our base texture. Now we're going to look at doing some decals, right? So in this Discord I got here, I've got a little channel with some decals. So I'm just going to gather some of those. So what you want to make sure is that when you're gathering decals, they've always got a transparency layer. So if I click this, I can see stuff behind it. I know it's transparent. The reason being is that transparency layer, we're actually going to use that as a mask. So in the shader, we're going to say the bits that are transparent will just be the brick texture, but the bits that aren't transparent will be where the decal goes, because that transparency is literally just a black and white. So I'm just going to grab some of these, going to bring them into my folder, and what we can do is we're going to make a little atlas out of these in Photoshop. Okay, so I've got Photoshop open here. Going to go make a new document. Going to make it 2048 by 2048. Now these textures I've got here, I'm just going to bring them in. Double click to confirm. Now over in my layers panel, you see I've got my 3 decals here. I'm going to turn off the background because now we've got this checker. That's the transparent part. Now I'm just going to not spend too much time doing this. I'm just going to position this, make it a bit bigger. I'm just going to click and drag the bounding box there. If you don't see a bounding box, you need to turn it on at the top here, show transform controls. Actually, I'm going to leave a little bit of space around them. It always helps over the space around them. And normally I would spend a lot of time getting these all packed up efficiently, but for this it's going to be fine just to have it just like that for now. Okay, now I'm going to export this. I'm going to go File, Export, Quick Export as PNG. Gonna find the folder that we're working in. I'm going to call this Graffiti Atlas. Okay, now go back into Unity. You see I've got this file's appeared here now, and you see we've got these channels here. So we've got a red channel, a green channel, blue channel, and an alpha channel, and it's that alpha channel that we're going to use as a mask. Now what's a mask? So if I go back into Photoshop, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up a snipping tool, take a quick screenshot of this texture, and bring this into Photoshop. I'm going to paste it, I'm going to bring it to the bottom, bring the size up. Okay, so let's pretend that these graffiti textures don't have transparency, right? I'm gonna come here and I'm gonna snip in tool this as well, so it's got a background around it. Gonna bring this in. Okay, so now how are we gonna mask this out? Okay, so what a mask is a black and white image. Okay, so I'm gonna turn these off for a minute. I'm gonna make a new layer that's just gonna be white. I'm gonna choose white here. I'm gonna press Control Backspace on my keyboard. I'm gonna press X to swap the selected color. I'm gonna press Control Backspace. Now we've got a white image. Now I'm gonna press X again. And I'm gonna change this to black. And now I'm going to paint in where I think roughly that graffiti is. Now what this is this is a mask. We can use this as a mask. So now I'm going to Control A, Control C, copy that. Now I'm going to Control D to deselect, turn that off. Now I'm going to turn this back on. Now for this layer of the graffiti, I'm going to go to this button down here, which creates a layer mask. And now I'm going to hold Control and click it. Sorry, I'm going to hold Alt and click it. Now I'm in the mask mode. I'm going to paste that little mask in. Now I'm going to go click this to go back, and I've done it the opposite way. So I'm going to press Alt and click back into the mask again. I'm going to press Control I to invert. I'm going to press this to go back to the main. Now you see that black and white image that I've made is now being used as a mask. So the bits that are black don't let anything through, and the bits that are white do let the image through. Obviously this isn't a perfect mask, but it's just to illustrate what a mask does. A mask is a black and white image that basically lets stuff through, right? So in our shader, we're going to use this black and white transparency layer that came out of Photoshop with our little atlas that we made. We're going to use that as the mask, and then we're going to use that mask to let the color parts go over the image. Okay, but how are we going to do that? How are we going to position them? So we're going to go back to 3ds Max, and I'm going to create a new material in here, and I'm going to bring in my atlas. I'm just going to go show an explorer. Going to bring this in, make a material, and apply it. Okay. Now this isn't the layout that I want. I might actually just want for this wall just this bottom bit of graffiti, and then if I was to have another instance of this wall, maybe I'll use a different bit, but for this I'm just going to have one bit of graffiti, right? So I'm going to go unwrap UVW, edit in UV editor, and I'm going to choose my atlas here so I can see it, and I'm going to take my face and I'm just going to place that around there. Now you see it's going to be stretched, right? So that's no good. Okay, so I'm going to delete that. Now I'm going to place some cuts in this. Okay, so I'm going to edit poly, and now I'm going to do 2 connects, some little loops there. Now I'm going to select this edge, bring it down, so I want that graffiti roughly in the middle of the wall somewhere, something like that. So now we've done that, actually maybe I'll bring this one down a little bit. Okay, now I'm gonna unwrap again, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna flatten mapping to separate all these faces out. I'm gonna preview my atlas again. Now this top bit, this bottom bit, I don't actually want to be shown in the atlases, any graffiti, so I'm going to just resize these down and put them in a bit that I know is transparent. Right, now I forgot to detach that. Now I'm going to select just this middle face, going to flatten it again, and now I'm going to hold control, resize this down, so now I've got, actually it needs to be a little bit bigger, doesn't it? Something like that. So now we've got the transparent parts of our atlas is here and here, and now we've got this bit where we want it to be, and that should be fine. So I'm going to collapse, going to export again, and overwrite the wall I've already exported. Going to go back into Unity. So now I've got my mesh here. If I turn on wireframe mode, I should be able to verify that it's updated, and yeah, I can see the lines of it there. Okay, so how are we going to use this? So we're going to go back to our blend shader. Now, one of the things that I didn't go over there is that when I unwrapped this, I did it on UV channel 1, which is UV 0 in Unity. So you've got 4 different UV channels to work with. I use all 4 of them usually. For this, I'm going to do it on UV channel 0 or 1 in 3ds Max. So how are we going to do this? So I'm going to bring these down a little bit. Now I'm going to make a new texture 2D input, and I'm going to call this Decal Atlas, because it can be generic. You know, we can swap this out to be whatever we want later on. I'm going to bring this master out a bit more. Now I'm going to sample this Decal Atlas texture, same as before. I'm going to sample texture 2D. This time I don't want it to be triplanar because I am actually using UV positioning now. That means I don't have to do any UVing, but for this we do want to do UVing, right? Because we want to have control over where the atlas is going to go. So I'm going to bring this Decal Atlas texture in, going to connect it to the texture slot. See, I've UV 0, so I'm using the first UV channel as we did it in 3ds Max. Now, for now I'm just going to plumb that straight to the base color output just to see if it's working. And it's not, and that's because I haven't imported the texture into the actual material yet, the use of the shader. So gonna get this graffiti atlas, drop that in there, and now you see we've got it, but it doesn't look quite right. We've got these lines and it's not being masked. Okay, so that's what we need to do next. Gonna go back into my blend shader. I'm gonna make a lerp node. Okay, so I'm gonna just quickly plumb this in and then I'll talk over what it does. So, as we remember when we looked at our graffiti atlas before, we've got our red channel, green channel, blue channel, alpha channel, and the alpha channel is what we want to use as a mask. So the lerp node in shader graph is a lot like what I was doing in Photoshop with this layer mask. Okay. Go back to Unity. So what we're going to do with the lerp node is we're going to take our base albedo. So we've done all these changes to our brick texture, the albedo. We're going to put that into the first slot. Now we want to be blending. We want to be blending our decal atlas in with this brick texture, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take all of this decal output. We're gonna put that into the second slot here. So now what will be happening here without anything in the third slot is we've got our bricks texture, and now that's being completely overridden by this second slot of the decal atlas. But what we want to be doing really is blending the brick texture with the graffiti texture by using the mask with the alpha channel here. So we're going to take from the decal atlas sample, we're going to take the A channel just here, and we're going to plumb that into the third slot of lerp, and now the lerp output we're going to put into the base color. Now we're going to save that, go back to the scene, and just like magic, now we've got graffiti on this wall, and it's being affected by the brick texture, and it's looking kind of nice. Now if I wanted to have another wall that didn't have any graffiti on, I would come back to 3ds Max. I would duplicate this out, and then I would UV this again to not have that, or maybe to have a different graffiti there. But I'm not going to do that. You guys can do that. But you see, this looks kind of nice, and it's doing what we want. Now it's not really interacting with the brick texture underneath. I mean, it's using the normal map. It's being overlaid over the normal map, which is fine. But maybe we want some of this paint to not look so fresh. You see, if we scroll into this, it's looking super too perfect, right? So we want to be maybe using the height map of our brick, or maybe we want to be using an imperfection texture to break this up a bit. So let's have a look at using imperfection texture. So I'm going to open up Bridge. I'm going to go to the imperfections. I've already got a bunch, and you can download these. So I'm going to, what will be a good one for this? Maybe this one will have a nice effect. I'm going to go to Files. I'm not going to import that into Unity directly. So we've got a mask here, and we've got a roughness, and what we want is one that's got a lot of contrast. So not really this, but this has a lot of contrast, right? That's good. We've got blacks and we've got whites, and that will be good for what we need. So I'm going to take this into our little folder here. Okay, so what we're going to do here, we've got the alpha channel of our graffiti atlas, which is a black and white image, and what we want to do is we want to make that less black and white. We want to be bringing in more black bits to basically mean more of the brick texture coming through and less of the graffiti texture. Now let's jump into Photoshop to see what that would look like. I'm gonna take a little screenshot of this. Gonna bring that into Photoshop, turn this lot off, paste that in, bring the size up a bit. So that's our mask. But what we really want is we want more detail on this mask. We want more black bits. Okay, so this texture that I've got here, I'm gonna just bring this into Photoshop as well, because doing this in Photoshop is actually a good way of previewing it. So previewing the blend modes. So I'm gonna zoom out a bit. And I'm just gonna switch through these. So what does multiply do? So multiply is perfect. So multiply does exactly what we want. So if I turn that off, now it's solid white and solid black, and the solid black stays solid black, which is exactly what we want. But the solid white becomes now kind of it's affected by this mask. So we know we need a multiply. So you can do in shader graph, you can do all these different options that you got here, difference, exclusion, subtract. Sometimes they can become useful. Sometimes you want to be using a lighten, but for this, multiply is perfect. So that's what we want to be doing with our mask inside the shader graph before we use it to blend the actual albedo of the graffiti onto the albedo of the bricks. Okay, so I'm going to come back here and I'm going to do a new sample. We're going to call this decal blend mask, and I have done that wrong because I've done a vector 1. I'm going to go back, do a text 2D instead. Decal blend mask. Okay, now this decal atlas, I'm just going to duplicate that for easiness sake. And actually I've realised I want to be doing this as triplanar actually, so I don't want to have to UV this mask. So I'm going to bring this decal blend mask in, going to connect to the texture slot. Now how do we do this? So we know that we need to be affecting this black and white image that's coming out of our graffiti atlas's alpha channel. So instead of this alpha channel going straight from here to the lerp node, we want to be doing some stuff to it before it gets to the lerp node. So we're going to put in a new node here, call it blend, and we're going to change the blend mode to multiply, as we know. So we're going to take the alpha channel as our base layer, just as we did in Photoshop. We have our mask over this is our base, and we put that over the top, right? So we're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to take the alpha channel as the base, which is this. We're going to take our mask, our blend mask, and we're going to put that into the blend slot, and we're going to leave the opacity as 1 for now. Actually, no, you know what? We can make a slider for that as well. Let's call it decal blend mask amount. Going to set it as a slider, min 0, max 1. That's fine. Bring those up, drag that in, set this blend mask amount into the opacity slot, which basically affects how much it's being applied. Now we're going to take the output of this now and connect that to the third slot of the lerp node instead of it going directly from the atlas. So now if we save that, come back to here. Now this isn't doing anything yet because we haven't actually brought this mask in, so I'm going to drag this over here, put it there. Now I'm going to bring this slider up, and now you see it's kind of being, it's fading it out a bit, right? But it's not doing it quite perfect, and what we want to be doing here is being able to control the strength of this mask. So much like we did with the contrast sliders for the actual brick, we want to have a contrast slider that controls this blend mask, right? So gonna put in a new control here, gonna call this decal blend mask contrast. Gonna just tidy this up a little bit, although it doesn't look that tidy still, but I'm gonna call this contrast, bring this in. We're gonna change this contrast slider to be a slider. We're gonna go min 0, max 4, maybe we'll go min -4 as well, just in case we want to invert it. And now we can connect that to there. Now the decal blend mask that we're using, we're gonna take this output into the input, this contrast first now, before going to the blend slot of the blend node where we blend the two together. Now if we go back to here, drag this up a bit. Now you should start to see that we're getting a bit of detail in here, but it's too small because we're using the triplanar. So gonna add in a new control. We're gonna call it decal blend tiling. Gonna make it a slider. We're gonna drag this in, connect that to the tiling slot of this triplanar node, and we're gonna go min 0, max 1. That should be fine. Bring that up, and now I'm gonna change the control of this, and it looks pretty good. Maybe if we go into the negative here, it'll work a bit better. Now it's starting to get a bit of extra detail in there. So you can play this to your heart's content. I've used one mask here. It doesn't look that good, but you can see that, yeah, if we drag this up, you can begin to get a bit of control here. Actually, it looks to me like I need to do an invert on this. Okay, so this mask that we're using right here, I want to invert that, so I'm going to create a new node. I'm going to call it invert colors. Going to bring this in, going to invert everything, and I'll take that to where it was going before. See how that looks, and that's looking a bit better now. We've got a bit of brick coming through. Let's affect the tiling a bit, and I think actually the mask that I'm using itself isn't that good, so I've got some that I've used before. I'm just going to bring some of those in instead, maybe. And now I've got a bit of break up there. Lets a bit of brick through every now and then. This doesn't look too great. You could spend a lot more time perfecting this, but that's the basics of kind of getting a decal on there. And as you can see, the decal is UV position, so if I move the view around, it stays still, but the brick moves. And I think that's pretty much it for this first tutorial. Catch you in the next one, guys.